Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, a history of Valois Burgundy. Episode 1, The Burgundians and Their Kingdoms. Hi, my name is Josh Zucker, and I hope to be your guide through the next 50 or so episodes through the ups and downs of Burgundy in the 14th and 15th centuries. At least I'm guessing this story will take about 50 episodes to tell, but at this point it's hard to say. So why Burgundy? In short, because it's an incredibly interesting and, in my opinion, undertold story. While I'm sure this history is very well known in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and to a lesser extent Germany, Switzerland, and England, in America it's relatively obscure. My interest in Valois Burgundy began in high school when my history teacher Dr. Young would volunteer her classroom as a refuge when students wanted to get out of school assemblies. During one such assembly, I grabbed a random book from her bookshelf and began reading. The book was a biography on the French king Louis XI, and one of the central focuses of it was his struggles with Charles the Bold. I was enthralled by the political intrigues and dramatic warfare of the two, and especially captivated by the attempts of Charles the Bold to forge Burgundy from a collection of duchies, counties, and lordships into an independent state. I was struck by what could have been. If he had succeeded, the Kingdom of Burgundy, or possibly Lotharingia, would have been comprised of modern-day Belgium, almost all of the Netherlands and Luxembourg, as well as a significant portion of eastern France, unsurprisingly including the region of Burgundy itself, and many parts of western Germany. I should take this moment to add the disclaimer that I speak neither French nor Dutch, and so will apologize in advance for what I'm sure will be many pronunciation errors, and will be open to and grateful for correction if anyone gets fed up with me enough to offer it. Okay, now back to Burgundy. Burgundy is also emblematic of Europe's transition from the medieval era to the early modern. In this time, Flanders, Brabant, Holland, and Zeeland, much of the modern states of Belgium and the Netherlands, were some of the most densely urbanized areas in Europe, and some of the most heavily commercialized. While we still are a ways away from the rise of capitalism by the end of Charles the Bold's reign, we do see a significant rise of commerce, gunpowder weapons, state power, and organization in the period that Valois Burgundy stretches over. In many ways, we can see this as a case study for the first inklings of modernity in Europe. While Burgundy's story is more of a late medieval tale than an early modern one, it would not be inaccurate to call it early modern. Furthermore, Burgundy's conflicts with France and the Holy Roman Empire give a good window into the state of those states at the time, especially with France. Louis XI's conflict with Charles the Bold is just as critical in the story of how France became a coherent state as it is with the story of why Burgundy did not. I might even argue that it's just as important in the story of how France became a coherent state as the reign of Louis XIV, or possibly even the French Revolution. Now for a brief syllabus. I plan to start the series in the late days of the Roman Empire to talk about the Burgundians, a Germanic tribe that doesn't get nearly the same attention as the Franks, Goths, or Vandals, and the origins of Burgundy. After that, I'd like to touch on Burgundy under the Merovingians and later the Carolingians, and the short-lived kingdom of Lotharingia, a kingdom which gave much inspiration to our Dukes of Burgundy. Then I want to touch on Capetian Burgundy before going into the origins and early stages of the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War is important to grasp, as much of our story will take place in the midst of it, and all the rest will take place in a time where tensions could have reignited it at any moment. After that, I finally plan on getting to Philip the Bold, the first Valois Duke of Burgundy. Once I get to Philip the Bold, the pace of the podcast should slow down immensely. I plan on mostly covering the narrative history of Valois Burgundy, with the occasional break to talk about its geography, as well as the occasional episode on governmental structure, economy, court life, art, as well as biographies on certain interesting people that prop up from time to time, most notably Joan of Arc. I plan on taking the narrative at least to the death of Charles the Bold, and likely to that of his daughter Mary the Rich. There is a chance that I'll go as far as Charles V, but I'm not making any promises at this point. Finally, I plan on releasing a few episodes on why Burgundy worked for as long as it did, and why it ultimately failed. If that all sounds interesting to you, I sincerely hope that you will join me for a history of Valois Burgundy. Today, we're going back to the last days of the Western Roman Empire to talk about the people that caused Burgundy to be called Burgundy. Before we get started, I'd like to make a quick note about names and dates. I've included them where I thought it would add clarity and excluded them for the same reason. There's still going to be a lot of them, so don't worry if some of it goes over your head. This episode mainly exists because I'm a sucker for historical context, and the Kingdom of Burgundy becomes somewhat of an inspiration to the ambitions of our dukes down the road. Now, on with the show. The people that give their name to Burgundy are unsurprisingly known as the Burgundians. The Burgundians, like many of the Germanic tribes that menaced the Roman Empire, are thought to have originated in or around Scandinavia before moving southwest. Our namesake tribe first appears in the historical record in the 1st century CE. They are briefly mentioned by Pliny in Natural History, and they are stated to be a component of the Vandals. The Vandals were more of a federation of tribes than a single ethnic group, so it is possible that the Burgundians were, at that time, one component member. Also possible is that, as the Romans had not had much contact with either the Burgundians or the Vandals at this point, Pliny was simply mistaken. However, we do know that a few hundred years later, the Burgundians and the Vandals would be separate tribes. The Burgundians, after many encounters with Rome over the years, crossed over the Rhine for good in the winter of 406-407, along with a whole host of other tribes, including the Vandals. The crossing of the Rhine, as this event would be known as, is both a pivotal moment in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and a continuation of Roman history and policy up to that point. Throughout the years leading up to 406, German raids across the Rhine had grown more and more common, and large raids where multiple tribes coordinated with each other had occurred going back to the crisis of the 3rd century. Even the practice of barbarians settling in the Roman Empire was not new, and at this point many tribes, including the Franks, had agreements with the empire to settle within its borders and acted as a sort of frontier defense. You could even argue that this settlement was the latest version of the process of Romanization that goes back to the city's first attempts at expansion. However, the empire was still recovering from the last large, chaotic influx of barbarians, the Goths, some 30 years earlier. Our supergroup of Roman tribes plundered their way all across Roman Gaul, roughly the area of Western Europe between the Pyrenees Mountains, the Alps, and the Rhine River, before settling down. Over the next few years, the Roman army succeeded in defeating many of the tribes, and the Roman state succeeded in making treaties and alliances with many others. But significant damage had already been done. The Burgundians, among many others, were in Gaul to stay. For the next several years, the Burgundians were a middling power along the lower Rhine. They did not have the manpower of the Franks, Vandals, or Goths, but they were not a force to be ignored. In 411, the Burgundian king Gundahar, along with the Alans, another Germanic tribe squatting in Roman Gaul, raised a Gallo-Roman aristocrat named Jovinus to the rank of emperor in the wake of the decline of the sometimes legitimate emperor, sometimes usurping general, Constantine III. This elevation was not without precedence, as only a few years earlier the Goths had elevated a Roman senator named Priscus Attalus to emperor. The elevation of Jovinus was likely to confirm the gains that the barbarians had made at the expense of the Roman state, as the elevation of Attalus was done in an attempt by the Goths to secure a better settlement with Rome. It appears that Constantine's fall was in part contributed to by Jovinus's rise, as after the general began to face setbacks, two of his pillars of support, the Burgundians and Alans, abandoned him in order to try their luck with a new imperial usurper. That being said, the timeline is not entirely clear, and it is also possible that upon the fall of Constantine, many of his supporters decided to raise Jovinus up, and so Jovinus can be thought of as a successor to, rather than a rival of, Constantine. In the wake of the deposition of Attalus, also by the Goths, the tribe found themselves in a tense détente with the court of the legitimate emperor Honorius. When relations inevitably worsened again, the Goths decided to make their way to Gaul to join Jovinus's rebellion. However, the Gothic-Burgundian-Alan alliance would not last long. Shortly after they joined, the Goths were alienated by the other powers behind Jovinus's throne and decided to switch their allegiance back to the court of Honorius. With the Goths and the legions acting in tandem, the revolt of Jovinus was put down. Gaul was brought back, however unwillingly, to the imperial fold after the twin revolts of Constantine and Jovinus, and the Burgundians and Alans were forced into peace with Rome. The Burgundians, after making peace with the court of Honorius, agreed to act as foederati, or tribes allied with the Romans to defend the emperor's borders, and in exchange were allowed to settle in the area around the west bank of the middle Rhine, and so kept the lands they had ruled while backing Jovinus. Despite now being officially allied with the empire, the Burgundians, like many of the rest of the foederati, looked after themselves long before looking after Rome. Around 435, the Burgundian king Gundahar decided to look to the west in search of land and plunder, likely after facing some pressure from the Huns across the Rhine. He decided to attack the neighboring Roman province of Gallia Belgica, a territory that encompassed parts of modern-day Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and Germany. This marks the first, but not the last time that this area would be targeted for expansion by a Burgundian polity. This first attempt did not go well for the Burgundians, and, to state matters bluntly, it was a disaster. The Romans, who were forced to ignore or wait out many such raids throughout the century, chose to pursue the Burgundians with vigor. Aetius, the Magister Militum, or head general, whose interesting and tumultuous story only briefly intersects with this one, defeated the Burgundians and later used his own connections with the Huns to invite them across the Rhine to decimate them. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Decimation technically refers to the destruction of a tenth of a given population. The Huns obliterated the Burgundians. Sources claim that over half the Burgundians were killed in the Hunnic raid, along with the Burgundian king Gundahar. While this claim is likely an exaggeration, although we should not discount Hunnic might, what is clear is that the Burgundians who survived were beyond cowed and would have to slowly build up their strength before becoming a notable power again. And so ends the first Burgundian kingdom, the first polity to bear the name of Burgundy. Sometime after their catastrophic run-in with the Huns, either Aetius moved the Burgundian rump south into the region of Savoy, south of Lake Geneva, or the Burgundians moved themselves there with the permission of Aetius. And it is in this move in 443 that the Burgundian kingdom, which would outlast Rome and give its name to the duchy that is the focus of our podcast, has its roots. These Burgundians had learned from the mistakes of the past, and would now ally with Rome. First with Aetius against the Hun invasion of 451, and following the general's death with his successor as non-imperial leader of the West, Ricamir, another man whose interesting life unfortunately will only get briefly mentioned in our story. In fact, the new Burgundian king, Gundahar, married the younger sister of Ricamir, and the Burgundians would be close allies of Rome's new Magister Militum for the remainder of his life. The Burgundians would spend the next 2 decades before the official fall of the Western Roman Empire, expanding little by little. Their first attempts at expansion were thwarted by the new emperor and partner of Ricamir, Majorian. But after the two leaders of Rome fell out with each other, leading to Majorian's assassination, Gundahar was able to resume his expansion unimpeded by the imperial court. The Burgundians would expand outwards into the Rhone Valley and much of modern-day Burgundy by the time of Ricamir's death in 472. The Burgundians had re-established much of their power and prestige that had been destroyed by the Huns almost 40 years earlier. In fact, the Burgundians' fortuitous position between the rest of Gaul and Italy, along with close family ties between their royal house and Ricamir, even allowed one of Gundahar's sons, Gundabad, to claim Ricamir's title of patrician upon his death, and even follow in Gundahar's footsteps by raising a man named Glycerius to the Western Roman throne following a short interregnum after the previous emperor's death. Gundabad was able to successfully act as the power behind the throne for about a year, but unfortunately for his imperial ambitions, the death of Gundahar shortly thereafter forced Gundabad to return to Burgundia to struggle with his brothers for the crown of the Burgundians. Without the patrician's presence in Italy, Glycerius quickly fell to an attempt from the Eastern Roman Empire to re-establish control over the court of the West. However, Gundabad's retreat from Italy was not for nothing, as he was able to wrest control of his kingdom from his brothers. As Gregory of Tours relates, Gundabad was quickly able to dispatch 2 of his brothers and shared power with another brother, Godegisel, as the senior partner. It appears that while Gundabad ruled Burgundy, he allowed his brother the Principality of Geneva as a fief. Around this time, Gregory claims that Clovis, king of the Franks, requested the hand of Gundabad's niece, Clotilda, the daughter of his murdered brother Chilperic. While Gregory of Tours implies that Clovis imposed his will upon an intimidated Gundabad, he is also a famous Clovis fanboy, and it is just as likely, if not more so, that Gundabad used his niece as a diplomatic tool, the way that royal children had been used for centuries before and would be used for centuries going forward. Clotilda is famous in her own right for being the queen that convinced Clovis to convert to Nicene or Catholic Christianity, and is recognized as a saint by both the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches. This is interesting, as the Burgundians were, for the most part, Arian Christians. While the differences between Arian and Nicene Christianity are interesting and at times vague, the important thing to know is that each sect considered the other heretical and that the Nicenes would win out in the end. Going forward in this episode, I will be primarily relying on the history of Gregory of Tours, as his tends to be the most accepted. However, Procopius, the historian and companion of Justinian and Belisarius, has his own history, which touches on the conflicts of the Burgundians and Franks, but contradicts Gregory's at times. Oh, and by the way, the Western Roman Empire fell. While it's hard to put a firm date on the actual fall, most historians have chosen 476, with the deposition of Romulus Augustulus, which happened sometime during Gundabad's power struggle. Now, if Savoy and the area around Lake Geneva aren't good enough geographical markers for you, Gregory of Tours chooses this time in his history to set out the location of the Burgundian kingdom. He writes that it spread around the Seine and Rhone rivers, the Vosges forest, and the Alps, and even had a Mediterranean port at Marseille. Other than some more attempts at expansion, now mostly at the Gothic kingdom of Italy's expense, the next major event for the Burgundians comes around 500. It seems that Godegeisel had gotten tired of being under his brother's thumb, and went to his nephew-in-law, the ascendant Clovis, to ask for help in taking over the Burgundian kingdom in exchange for a piece of it and a whole lot of tribute. When Gundabad heard that Clovis was on his way, he went to his brother and asked for assistance driving the Franks off. The two Burgundian brothers were able to assemble an army in parity with that of Clovis, but, due to Godegeisel's treachery, the Frankish and Genevan armies were able to trounce the Burgundian king at Dijon. Gundabad fled south throughout his territory, landing at the city of Avignon. Godegeisel marched triumphantly into Gundabad's capital of Vienne, while the older brother was besieged in Avignon by the Franks. After a long siege, Gundabad sued for peace and was able to keep his life and his title as king in return for a large tribute to Clovis and a promise not to take revenge on his brother. Unfortunately for Godegeisel, the enraged Gundabad had no intention on keeping him alive. He laid siege to Vienne, and thanks to a disgruntled commoner who had been forced out of the city due to food shortages, was able to breach the walls by climbing through the city's aqueduct system. Godegeisel took refuge in a church, but was slain along with the bishop of the church and many high-ranking Burgundians that sided with the losing brother. While Gundabad was merciless to his brother, he was not so to his people. One of his most famous acts was the promulgation of the Lex Burgundionum and the Lex Romana Burgundionum, sets of law codes inspired by both German and Roman law. The codes are different and apply to inter-Burgundian and Burgundian-Roman disputes respectively, the former generally being seen as an attempt to dissuade the long and destructive tradition of blood feuds. The Lex Burgundionum was one of the first law codes to appear in these post-Roman Germanic kingdoms, and would outlast the independent Burgundian kingdom. It was adopted by the Franks and would remain in use for centuries with various additions and revisions. We next hear of the Burgundians being dragged into a pan-Germanic conflict. The details of this war are fairly confusing, and rely on a lot of diplomacy between the Goths and the Franks, as well as knowledge of growing Frankish power. To sum things up, tensions between the Visigoths in Spain and Aquitaine and the Franks had been rising for a while. The Ostrogoths in Italy and the Burgundians had tried to prevent the two powers from going to war. And in fact, a few letters between the king of the Ostrogoths and Gundabad have survived. It also should be noted that the Burgundians had a vested interest in keeping the kingdoms at peace, as their territory lay directly between the Visigothic and Frankish kingdoms. However, the peace did not hold, and war soon broke out between the two, with the Burgundians supporting the Franks and the Ostrogoths supporting the Visigoths. The Franks would win the war and gain Aquitaine, and the Burgundians, in exchange for their help, would win some territory to their south, only to lose it to an Ostrogothic counteroffensive. So, in the end, all the Burgundians had to show for their efforts was the trouble of having multiple armies march through their territory. Gregory of Tours paints this conflict as one of Arian versus Nicene Christianity, and heavily implied that Gundabad had secretly converted to Nicene Christianity, or at least supported that branch of Christianity at the time. That being said, the fact that the Burgundians ruled over a much larger Gallo-Roman population that was Nicene Christian meant that Gundabad was forced to tolerate it at the very least, and this most likely contributed to his own son's conversion. Not long after the war between the Franks and the Goths, Clovis died. Due to the Frankish tradition of split inheritance, something that will come around next episode and culminate with the dissolution of Charlemagne's empire, the Frankish kingdom was split between Clovis's 4 sons, 3 of which were the sons of Clotilda. While the sons of Clovis, at least for the moment, got along much better than the sons of Gundahar, the split of the Frankish kingdom still watered down the power of each individual kingdom significantly, and for a short while the kingdom of the Burgundians would be the preeminent kingdom of post-Roman Gaul. Gundahar was able to enjoy his new prestige for about 5 years before following Clovis to the grave. He would be succeeded by his son Sigismund, who shares a name with the Holy Roman Emperor we will be dealing with a lot later in our story. Not too much happened in Sigismund's early reign, so I'll give you a quick rundown. He was a Nicene Christian, he built an abbey to St. Maurice, he married the daughter of the king of the Ostrogoths and had a son with her, and after her death he killed that son because of a jealous stepmother. Despite that last thing, he would later be canonized as a saint, probably because of the whole choosing the right branch of Christianity thing. Due to the aforementioned not getting along of the sons of Gundahar, Clotilda, after biding her time for decades, decided that the opportunity had come to take revenge on behalf of her parents. The Queen Mother goaded her sons and stepson into a war with Burgundy, and in 523 they marched against Sigismund and his brother Godemar. They were able to overwhelm the Burgundian forces and capture Sigismund, who was shortly thereafter put to death. Godemar was able to rally his forces and push back the Frankish brothers and even kill one of them. And so for the next decade or so he remained king of the Burgundians. That being said, his territory would continually be chipped away by the Frankish brothers. However, his luck, limited though it was, would not last forever. Either the want of vengeance, territorial expansion, or both, would precipitate another major Frankish invasion in 534, led by King Clothar. It is in this war that Godemar would be killed and the Burgundian kingdom would fall to the Franks. And while the self-styled Burgundians no longer ruled, the common practice of wedding Burgundian princesses to Frankish princes had caused Clovis's line to become as Burgundian as it was Frank. And so 534 marks the end of the independent kingdom of Burgundy. At least for like 30 years, until it's given to one of Clothar's sons upon his death, due to the entropic nature of Salic law inheritance. Next time, we will take a look at Burgundy under first the Merovingians, as the dynasty Clovis helped found was known, and then under the Carolingians. I hope you'll join me. If you're interested in keeping up with news about the show, you can follow me at twitter.com/ValoisBurgundy. Thank you so much for listening.